Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
So we're happy to have today's chapel speaker, Dr. Lin McLaughlin, professor of Christian education and chairman of the CE department. He received an MA in Christian education at Dallas Seminary in 1985, earned a PhD in higher education administration at the University of North Texas in Denton. Over the past 30 years of ministry, Dr. McLaughlin served for a short time as a campus staff member for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of Texas in Austin, was a pastor of Christian education at two churches in the area, and served as a guest professor at the Greek Bible Institute in Athens for a year before joining the DTS faculty in 1996. Dr. McLaughlin has also been active in the past on the Texas Sunday School Association Board and currently serves on the board of the Professional Association of Christian Educators. In administration and assessment, Lin is an expert in the field. His colleagues joke about his love for the latest and the greatest in office supplies. They claim he likes Office Depot and Staples the way the rest of us like an ice cream store. That's a little unusual, yes. Lin and his wife, Marcia, have 3 adult children, and they're looking forward to their first grandchild to be born this July. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Lin McLaughlin as our chapel speaker today.
Yes, I do like office supplies. That's where I get my therapy. So some of the salesmen are my therapists, and I go back and sit in one of the office chairs, and they come and, talk to me about the latest Avery labels that are now available. When I get discouraged, I just go stand in front of my file cabinet and pull out the drawers and, push the folders around and feel a lot better after I've done that. So, a lot of weird stuff there, I admit. Well, we're in the home stretch here, that home stretch of getting close to finishing up, at least for the year. Just a little bit of time remains. I realize that there's a lot probably that you have to get done and are responsible for. And some of you are really in the home stretch, as in graduating, coming up here. Yeah, you're going to be finishing up and participating in a very primary way in commencement activities, commencement chapel and commencement itself. And another thing we look forward to is the recognition that's given, the giving of well-deserved awards for those who have diligently worked in different disciplines and different fields, and we celebrate with you based on what you've done. And of course, if you've been to commencement chapel or commencement or awards chapel, you know what some of those are, what kind of recognition is given. But let me ask you this, and before I say it, please don't read into it any kind of insinuated criticism about what we do here at DTS. I don't have an agenda, and I'm not trying to make a statement. But what about having an award for the weakest Christian on the DTS campus? What if we were somehow able to graduate you magna cum laude or summa cum laude in weakness? Would you like to put that on your resume? Or have that as a part of your credential? And what if even further we made the claim that in your weakness you were actually at your strongest? Wow, that's just balderdash. I mean, that's foolishness. Well, yeah, especially foolishness according to the world. And granted, we need to think about how we're defining weakness and what we mean by weakness. Weakness as compared to what? Or weakness as defined against what? If we somehow were talking about it as defined against somebody, some people like you or those on the stage up here, pursuing achievement and attainment of whatever sort or stripe for the honor and glory of God, probably wouldn't buy into that. But if we were talking about weakness as defined against or compared to a subtle but nonetheless very real adoption of the world's definition of strength and power, and thus wanted to counter that tendency, then we might think about adopting it or buying into it. Well, you probably know where I'm going. I think such is the case with Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And although I'll have a broader context to consider here, I'm going to start at verse 7. This is one of those more well-known and familiar passages, and I would expect you know it somewhat yourself. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surprisingly great revelations, and he's described that beginning in verse 1, although he refers to it in the third person, he's talking about himself being caught up into the third heaven and receiving visions and knowledge and information that man, normal man, was not allowed to know. Thus, he was not allowed to really share in detail. But nonetheless, he possessed that knowledge, which could inflate, maybe had a tendency at times to do so. So he says, I was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. There's that seemingly contradictory and counterintuitive thought, which really goes all the way back to the beginning of chapter 11, in what is sometimes called Paul's fool speech, depending on where you think it ends. I think it starts in verse 1 of chapter 11, based on my limited study, such as it is. And there he begins to use all kinds of, in a sense, grammatical and rhetorical devices and arguments. He uses parodies, he uses double entendre or entendre, however you choose to pronounce that. He uses irony, he uses satire. Sometimes it is so circuitous it's almost hard to follow. It's a little labyrinthine, but nonetheless, he's making a pretty powerful point. Now, I share this passage with 3 basic points in mind in terms of how it relates to me, Lin McLaughlin, and in terms of how I think it can relate to you and can relate to our time. Like Corinth, we are a society that is enamored with power. We are full of power brokers and power brokeries and power brokerages. That marks and characterizes our society and has for some time. We are drawn to power, and we desire power. I would go so far as to acknowledge and confess to you that in reality, however humble and meek I might seem, I am in reality a power monger. I absolutely want power and go after it. My heart is pulled to it and is drawn to it in order to compensate for my weaknesses because I don't like my weaknesses and I really don't want to show them to anybody. But boy, do they ever come out like crazy. So I'm pulled to this power. And the nature of power, of course, is that it leads to a very inflated view of oneself, one's work, one's ministry, depending on whether it's Christian or non-Christian, but it can happen to Christians as well. And maybe not in the most overt of ways, but in subtle ways, we begin to boast. You know, I mean, we're not going to come right out usually and say, hey, man, I'm the greatest preacher, communicator, exegete that you have ever known or you will have ever heard. We're not going to do that sort of thing. But again, ever so subtly, we might insert at the proper moment our GPA, and we might say, well, I was just talking to somebody else and he asked me or she asked me what my GPA was, and I said, so it doesn't sound like we're really trying to say what in fact we're really trying to say. But we do that. I do that at least because I want people to know me for my power and not my weakness. That's a part of my culture. And so we have in this culture super CEOs, and we have super financiers, and we have super successful people, and we have super intellects, and we have super communicators, and we have super teachers. In nearly every sphere of life, there is the super so-and-so that represents the poster person, the poster woman, the poster man for what society at large, or Christians, or the church is to be. Paul faced the challenge of the super apostles. I'm going to go with the view that the super apostles were rivals in Corinth, as opposed to another translation, superlative apostles or eminent apostles, which could refer to the Jerusalem 12 and deriving authority and credibility from them. That's another view, but I'm going to go with the view that it's referring to his rivals. In fact, that phrase, I do not think I am the least inferior to these super apostles, occurs twice in this range of passages I'm looking at. Referring again in verse 11, I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am nothing. So let me ask you, when you face your tendencies to compare, or the tendencies of others to compare you against the power standard, against the power broker of whatever field or effort may be in mind, how do you feel? Do you ever, like me, feel inferior? Do you ever deal with a degree of inferiority or something of an inferiority complex? I sure know that in my own life, in my own struggles. Of course, Paul here is, again, he's utilizing a tool, an argumentative tool. He has decided, even though he doesn't really want to, that he's going to engage them on their own terms. If they're going to boast, well, he's going to resort reluctantly to himself boasting, even though he knows that this is not really the will of the Lord, and he knows that this is madness. I'm out of my mind to be doing it. But he does it in order to counter their arguments, because they are really advancing a different gospel and distorting the view of Christ, a view, the right view of the person of Jesus Christ. And that is a reason to have a word against, to fight and to resist those who would do such things. But in the midst of doing it, he is also talking about who he is, and he is disclosing himself, and especially in all of these passages, he's talking about something of an antidote to, a counter to this power culture, and that is weakness. It is weakness at all kinds of levels. One level is the weakness of his abilities. He doesn't have the oratorical and rhetorical skills that these super apostles do. And if you know anything about the culture, the Greco-Roman culture, then you understand that rhetoric and communication skills were considered preeminent. That was the thing that would advance you most. That is the kind of thing that could raise you out of poverty into riches, because, of course, you charged for it. Very powerful people, those who had those skills. Very powerful people of influence. These are the kinds of people you would want to attach yourself to and associate with. He doesn't have their skills, and that's considered a weakness. Have you ever faced the realization, your realization or the realization of others, that your skills and your abilities are limited? And perhaps been passed over as a result of that, or invalidated or marginalized because of that, even though you have something of substance to say and to share. Has nothing to do with your skill ability or your oratorical ability. But weakness has become a hindrance. So sometimes it's because of a limited skill. Sometimes the weakness is out of choice. Paul deliberately chooses not to utilize the means of power, the vehicles of power of this particular culture. He chooses to do the converse. He doesn't charge. And in not charging, and in fact freely giving of himself, lowering himself, as he says, in order to elevate that church, he is considered weak. So don't ever speak without charging somebody, I guess, is the upshot of that particular passage. And I'm going to bill you for calling me on the last minute to speak. So just kidding. Just kidding. So sometimes it has to do with Paul's strategy, and that's appropriate for us as well. Selectively chosen, strategically chosen ways of sending a countercultural message that's appropriate by discarding and disregarding the ways of the world, the ways of power. And of course, there are times in which weakness comes because of Satan's work and the work of demons, taking advantage perhaps of vulnerabilities that we already have, or in some supernatural way hindering us and our ministry and our work. So what are we going to do when we face those weaknesses, when we have to deal with those weaknesses? What are you going to do with that? Well, he tells us the principal way that he deals with these weaknesses. I've already read it to you. He asked the Lord to take away at least this one specific weakness, this thorn in the flesh, and don't need to tell you that that has been examined over and over again, but there's no definitive answer. Some people feel that it has to do with a physical weakness, a disease, of some sort that affected him physically. Maybe it had something to do with the eyes. Maybe it had something to do with even stammering or speaking or something else. Some people say the weakness fell into the category of some kind of psychological challenge or problem. It might have been some kind of spiritual oppression that he had to deal with on a continual basis. And then others say maybe it was a person who opposed his ministry, mobilized and empowered by demons and Satan, however directly or indirectly. But we don't have the answer. And of course, some commentators go so far as to say, which I generally adopt and would like to believe, that it's deliberately left ambiguous and vague, so that readers have the opportunity to fill in the blank with our weakness. Of course, this is a narrative passage, and it can't make it say that all of us are going to have a thorn in the flesh from Satan. But again, we can all relate to weakness. Do you have a theology of weakness? Or do you have a philosophy of ministering out of weakness? I'm not sure many of us do. Because again, most of us want to avoid the whole issue of weakness. But here's the thing. Ministry and life, and sometimes you've got to be a little further along than where most of you are to know this most fully. But ministry and life has a way of exposing the underbelly of our weaknesses. What in any other setting might be easily concealed or dampened or diminished, given the right life circumstance or ministry occasion, becomes magnified and amplified, and it is out there for everybody to see. So there is no way you can really spin it. It's just there. It's painful, it's hurtful, and it's embarrassing. But the fact of the matter is, no matter how much training that you get or how many degrees or how far you go in school, it isn't going to eliminate all those. You are going to take that with you into ministry. And believe you me, you will be dealing with a lot of other people who have weaknesses in ministry. In fact, it is really, as some of you have heard me say in class, a very, very messy situation. Ministry is extremely messy. It's not nearly as antiseptic and pristine as we would like for it to be. So I appreciate the fact that this passage is here. I confess and I acknowledge I have a vested interest in this passage because for the past 5 years I feel like I've been drowning in my own weaknesses. I've been very discouraged, very depressed, very hurt. And it's not necessarily because all the other people are bad people and doing bad things to me. It's for a whole range of reasons. Some of it has to do with season of life. My body's declining, and things aren't working like they used to, which I thought still would be in my 50s, and I'm talking about everything. I wanted to bring my super giant print Bible up here, but the problem was it was going to look like a pulpit Bible, and I wasn't strong enough to even carry it up here, so here I am having to deal with this. And so I thought on so many occasions, Lord, surely you don't want someone as weak as me, as weak as I have become, ministry. Surely I'm really too weak to be useful to you or to others. Can you relate to that? Have you ever been there? Or even if you had been there, would you let it be known? Aha, it's one of our problems. So we come to my third point. My need to rely upon the sufficient grace of Christ and the power of Christ resting on me in those times as a balm, as a healing agent and source to me and for me as I face the pain of weaknesses however they have come. Now, I need to learn about this. I'm still working at this. I'm struggling with it. And one of the reasons is because of how Paul talks about it. He says, because of that, I'm going to boast more gladly about my weaknesses. I'm going to, in fact, delight in my weaknesses. Well, I can't tell you that that's where I'm at. I wish I were there, but there's still a lot of me that doesn't want them. But I have to acknowledge them. And I need that sufficient grace of Christ. A sufficient grace. Sometimes that sufficient grace and that power comes in a direct form and manner, miraculously from Him. So that's one way that you can think about how to deal with your weaknesses, but I believe, this is my speculation, that it also comes in the form of help from others, other people, you out there helping each other, helping me, us helping each other in this ministry against heresy and against the kingdom of Christ, which is a battle. But for you to access that help means that you acknowledge your weakness, your weaknesses. Because until you do, you may not request the help. You won't be at the point where you're willing to ask. And hopefully our churches and our Christian organizations and our leaders will start to create an atmosphere of safety, not safety for sin, but safety and acceptance, such that we can be honest about where we are, not because we want to stay there, but because we need help. I've had to learn to ask for help from friends, from professionals, from medical personnel, from colleagues. And that is the ministry of Christ's grace that is sufficient enough to help me persevere in my ministry and in the faith, because His power is unlimited. So what would the child of weakness give for that kind of power? What would the child of weakness pay or ransom for that kind of power? Well, you know from the song that we just sang, it's already been paid for and ransomed. It's been supplied because Jesus paid it all. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for the strength that comes from you. And we testify here out of this passage, and we agree with Jeremiah and Paul as he invoked that passage from Jeremiah chapter 9, that we cannot boast in our wisdom, we cannot boast in our might, we cannot boast in our power, because the reality is we are unbelievably weak and vulnerable, however strong we wish we were. And in a culture of superheroes and one that promotes superheroes. We are vanquished at times from a human perspective. We are weak, but we are powerful in you. I need that power. I need to learn myself, and pray that you help me to learn to do what Paul did, which is to boast in your strength and to delight in my weaknesses, because that is the very location, that is the very place where your power is made most perfect. Amen.